Hello and welcome back to Cultural Geography. I will be making video lectures to accompany the chapters in your textbook. This video will highlight some of the key points in the chapter, but not all of them. So it's your job to be responsible for the materials covered in the textbook, as you will be quizzed on them. In this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of diffusion and how it pertains to cultural diffusion. So let's get to it. Culture is a set of shared ideas, actions, principles, beliefs, and values. Spatial diffusion is the process by which an idea or innovation is transmitted between individuals and groups across space. It enables dispersion of concepts or things from a central point of origin to other locations that may or may not be directly connected. Cultural diffusion is the spread of cultural ideas from their place of origin to other regions, groups, or nations. So one of the most critical concepts in cultural geography is how things spread through a population and from and to place. This is known as diffusion. So we'll take a look at some examples of diffusion in the coming slides here. So there are two broad types of diffusion. There is relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion. Relocation diffusion is the spread of an idea through physical movement of people from one place to another. Also, it's the movement of individuals who carry an idea or innovation with them to a new, perhaps distant locale. This is caused when people migrate from place to place and bring their culture with them. This is the cause for many different languages being in one area, such as the United States. Not only is language diffused, but so is religion and ethnicity as well. An example of this is how Christianity was brought to the New World by missionaries and colonists, by relocation diffusion. Another example is ancestry, which is shown in this map. From this map, we can see that our ancestors are relocated from, where they moved from. So there's very distinct patterns of this, whether it's African American, or German, or English, or Mexican. So these are all examples of relocation diffusion. So expansion diffusion is the process whereby information, a material, or disease, for example, spreads from one place to another. So, in expansion process, the item being diffused remains at that location and often intensifies in the originating region. So there are three types of expansion diffusion. There's hierarchical, contagious, and stimulus. So in the following slides, we're going to take a look at each type of these expansion diffusion. So hierarchical diffusion occurs when the diffusion, innovation, or concept spreads from a place or person of power or higher susceptibility to another in a leveled manner. So hierarchical diffusion can occur under two different methods. The most common method is for this trend or idea to start at a major city and first spread to other major cities, then to intermediate-sized cities, and later to small towns and rural areas. The second method is the spread of an idea from a person or persons of authority or power to other persons, such as political leaders, social elites, or the Pope. And this can be seen in this example here, where we have the green center as the hearth, the origin of whatever is going to be diffused, and it goes to these other areas of importance. So there's early diffusion as the purple, later diffusion as the orange, or important people. So an example of hierarchical diffusion is hip-hop music. So in the mid-1970s, the Bronx, New York, this is where hip-hop can trace its roots to. It would generally spread from major urban center to other urban areas. From there, it would spread outward to the suburbs. So in this image, we can think of this as the green dot being the Bronx, and from here it spread out to other urban areas, which were the early adopters, the purple dots, and then spread to the suburbs and later adopters, which are represented by these orange dots. So contagion diffusion occurs when numerous places or people near the point of origin become adopters or infected in the case of disease, and we'll look at disease coming up here. So contagion diffusion is the rapid, widespread diffusion of a characteristic through the population. So, for example, ideas that are spread through contagious diffusion are spread through the population would be the flu, for example, would be a good example of that. It starts with one person or place, and it keeps spreading. So in this diagram, think of a pebble being tossed in the pond, and it sends out these ripples. So contagious diffusion is strongly influenced by distance. Why? Well, for example, more likely you're to come into contact with nearby persons than distant persons. So for example, you are at the front of the bus standing next to a person with a cold. So you are more likely to catch that cold than the person at the back of the bus. And that's what this is saying here in this diagram. To illustrate contagious diffusion, we can look at Ebola virus and its spread in West Africa. So Ebola is caused by the infection of a virus. And there's actually several different viruses, but in this case we're just going to call it one virus. And Ebola viruses are found in several African countries. Ebola was first discovered in 1976 near the Ebola River, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Since then, outbreaks have appeared sporadically in Africa. So the natural reservoir host of Ebola virus remains unknown. However, on the basis of evidence and the nature of similar viruses, researchers believe that the virus is animal-borne and that bats are the most likely reservoir. So people get Ebola through direct contact, through broken skin or mucous membranes, for example, in the eyes or the nose or the mouth, with blood or bodily fluids, needles, and infected bats or primates. So we can look at this map here, and we can see at the top of the legend talks about the total Ebola deaths. And we can look at March of 2014, and we can see the outbreak here in bright red, and we can see in 2014 for April, it spread a little bit. And we can kind of see how it's spreading. It's still remaining a very high number of deaths in the hearth, or where it originated from, but it's spreading outward. And it's spreading outward from that place, and it's going out. This is an example of how contagious diffusion works. It starts out of the hearth, and it spreads out like that pebble in a pond. And here we all look to the March 2015. So this is a classic example of contagious diffusion. The next is stimulus diffusion, and it occurs when the innovative idea diffuses from its hearth, its origin, outward, but the original idea is changed by the new adopter. So McDonald's is a good example of this, as McDonald's spread to India. However, Indian Hindus do not eat beef. So Indian McDonald's serve veggie burgers, which is culturally acceptable. So the idea of, quote-unquote McDonald's hamburgers was acceptable, but not in its original form, hence stimulus diffusion. HIV and AIDS, if we look at this example here of this kind of mixed diffusion patterns, and diffusion doesn't always work just by one type of diffusion. Usually it happens with various types of diffusions occurring one after the next. And HIV and AIDS is an example of how a disease can diffuse or spread by multiple methods. It first came to large urban areas, hierarchical diffusion, and from there spread outwards by contagious diffusion. So this diffusion process is illustrated in this map of Ohio, where in 1983, Cleveland had the only known cases in Ohio. But it quickly spread to other major urban areas, as we can see, Columbus, and Dayton, and Cincinnati, and then later by contagious diffusion to smaller cities and later into towns. So we can look at from 1982 in the upper left down to 1990 in the lower right, and we can see how it has spread. So looking at the same years, So do you think if we were to look at the same years of HIV, would we see the similar pattern at a national scale? Definitely. We would see the same kind of pattern here. Major cities would have it, and it would diffuse to other major urban areas. So the next thing is this adoption of a phenomenon. And the adoption of a phenomenon generally follows this S-shaped curve. Take the case of a cellular phone purchase as an example. Initially, only a small number of purchases were made because very few people knew about the product, and few distributors offered it for sale. Later, the number of adopters grew exponentially as the earlier buyers spread the word through a large susceptible population, people who could afford it but had not yet purchased a cell phone. During this middle phase, the majority of the people who will eventually adopt do so. Ultimately, the rate of adoption tapers off as the number of susceptible people shrink and the novelty and the excitement of cell phones kind of wore off. The level of adoption will never quite reach 100%. Even in the most modern and wealthiest societies, there will always be people who choose not to live with a cell phone. And I'm sure people that you know don't have cell phones. I think probably most of the people who don't have cell phones are maybe people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and can't have a phone, and probably elderly people as well don't have a phone because they're just maybe not used to that technology and so forth. But it'll never reach 100%. So there are barriers to diffusion, and the diffusion of innovations, beliefs, cultural customs is not the same rate at all times over all spaces. A number of factors, such as physical, social, and economic, influence them. And these are called barriers when they obstruct the flow of information or the movement of people, thus slowing down or preventing the acceptance of an innovation. So distance is one such barrier to this. Interaction decreases with increase of distance between two areas. So physical features, such as uncrossable mountains or swamps, can act as barriers. A boundary between two antagonistic societies, unable or unwilling to communicate with each other, can be a barrier to the movement of innovations. Difficult terrain and oceans have also acted as barriers to diffusion, but they often deflect the path of diffusion rather than completely obstruct it. Another impenetrable barrier is due to cultural factors, where innovations are simply not accepted or allowed to spread because of customs and rigid social or religious controls forbid it. Linguistic barriers can hinder communication and slow down or even prevent diffusion of innovation. Governments, too, can act as barriers by banning or discouraging interaction with the foreign world and controlling media and literature flow. Physical barriers such as water bodies, deserts, swamps are in most cases, especially in the present day, of easy communication. These are permeable barriers. 100 years ago or so, they would have been definitely significant barriers. International boundaries similarly inhibit easily of diffusion of innovation due to considerations of economic and socio-political factors. So diffusion is a selective process. Receiving cultures may accept some and reject other innovations coming from other cultural areas, depending on their own cultural systems. So here is just a diagram illustrating the various types of diffusion. So we have contagious expansion diffusion on the left as it diffuses out, hierarchical diffusion, relocation diffusion. So these are all concepts that we have discussed so far. So here are some examples of cultural diffusion, and these are not something for you to memorize or worry about for the quizzes. They're just ways to kind of relate some of the things that we've talked about and things in your textbook to probably experiences or things you're familiar with going on around us. So common cultural diffusions. Some people in the United States play hockey. It's played in Canada, so it was the diffusion of hockey. The spread of music throughout the world shows cultural diffusion. For example, jazz started as a blend of the music of Africa and the Caribbean. Southern cities in the United States, especially border towns, have signs in both English and Spanish. Dropping down here, the French Quarter in New Orleans shows diffusion of French culture. We also have religious cultural diffusion. Christianity started in Israel and has spread all over the world. India is home to many religions: Buddhism, Christianity, Muslim, Hindu. The example of forced diffusion is the Spanish, French, English, and Portuguese forcing the native population of the Americas to become Christians. Islam has spread recently to the whole world. We also have diffusion of technology, gunpowder originating in China and eventually coming to Europe. The fax machine was developed in Germany. It was then made into a worldwide product by the Japanese. And then we have economic cultural diffusion. So clothes, cotton grown in one country, then is manufactured and made in another country. Coke products are found all over the world. McDonald's restaurants, as we just talked about. So these are ways that diffusion is happening all around us, whether we really kind of think about it or not. So on that note, have a good day.